The chamber was the largest room ever built by any species in the known galaxy. It stretched in a perfect circle, wide enough to hold thousands, and its ceiling disappeared into a soft blue glow that was meant to calm the nerves of every creature sitting beneath it. 214 delegations filled the curved rows of seats, each one representing an entire species, an entire world, sometimes an entire collection of worlds. This was the Galactic Union Council, and it had governed known space for over 12,000 standard cycles. It was old, it was powerful, and it was, above all else, quiet. That was the first thing Sam Bennett noticed when he took his seat for the very first time, 6 years ago. The silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a room when people are thinking. This was a different silence. It was heavy. It pressed down on everything. It lived in the walls, in the careful posture of every diplomat, and in the way no one looked at anyone else for too long. Sam was a human. He came from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, where he had spent 15 years as a settlement negotiator, helping neighbors resolve property disputes, helping small businesses argue with city councils, helping ordinary people find the right words when they were angry or scared or confused. He was not a soldier. He was not a scientist. He was a man who listened well and spoke carefully. And somehow that had been enough to get him appointed as Earth's ambassador to the largest governing body in the galaxy. His chief advisor was a woman named Megan Cole. She was a sociolinguist, which meant she studied the way language shaped societies. She had helped write Earth's first interstellar communication treaties, the documents that allowed humans to talk to alien species without accidentally starting a war. She was sharp, patient, and she noticed things that most people missed. She sat beside Sam at every session, her tablet filled with notes, her eyes always moving across the chamber. The reason the council was so quiet was simple. It was the law. The Codex of Measured Discourse had been written thousands of years before humans ever left their own planet. It was the foundational rule of the council, and it stated that no delegate could speak during an official session unless their words had been submitted in writing, reviewed by a senior linguistic auditor, and approved at least one full cycle in advance. Emotional language was forbidden. Raised voices were forbidden. Spontaneous speech of any kind was considered an act of diplomatic aggression and could result in sanctions against the offending species. Every word spoken in that chamber was scripted. Every pause was planned. Every silence was intentional. Sam hated it. He did not say this out loud, of course. He was too smart for that. But Megan could see it in the way he sat, and in the way his jaw tightened whenever a session dragged on for hours, while delegations read carefully prepared statements that said absolutely nothing of substance. She could see it in the way he looked at the smaller delegations, the ones who sat in the back rows with their heads down, saying nothing because they could not afford the cost of filing a formal statement. On this particular day, the session was focused on a trade proposal submitted by the Dravani hegemony, and the Dravani were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the Union. They were tall, thin-limbed, with smooth gray skin and eyes that reflected light like polished metal. They had been part of the council since nearly the beginning, and over the centuries they had learned to use the Codex better than anyone else. They knew exactly how to phrase a proposal so that it sounded fair while being anything but. The proposal on the table was about fuel distribution. Specifically, it would reroute 3 major fuel supply lines through Dravani-controlled space, adding transit fees that would triple the cost for any species that depended on those lines. 3 smaller species, the Pelori, the Yinesh, and the Saka, relied on those supply lines for nearly all of their energy needs. If the proposal passed, they would face a slow and quiet starvation. Not of food, but of power. Their grids would fail. Their hospitals would go dark. Their ships would sit grounded. Everyone in the chamber knew this. Sam could see it on their faces, or at least on the faces of those species whose expressions he had learned to read. The Pelori delegate, a small creature with deep brown fur and wide, worried eyes, sat perfectly still in its seat. It had not submitted any remarks for this session. It had not filed a formal objection within the required 3-cycle window, and so it would say nothing while its people were quietly sentenced to ruin. Sam leaned toward Megan. "Why didn't they object?" he whispered. Megan did not look up from her tablet. "They tried. Their objection was rejected by the linguistic auditor because it contained what was classified as emotionally charged language." "What did they say?" "They said the proposal would cause suffering." Sam stared at her. "And that was too emotional?" "The word suffering is flagged under Section 14 of the Codex. It is considered a subjective term that could provoke an unregulated emotional response in the chamber." Megan finally looked at him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were not. "They were told to rephrase. By the time they resubmitted, the objection window had closed." Sam turned back to the chamber. The Dravani delegate was reading the final summary of the proposal in a smooth, measured voice. Every word had been approved. Every sentence was perfectly constructed. It was clean and polished and utterly ruthless. He looked at the Pelori delegate again. It had closed its eyes. Sam sat back in his seat and said nothing, because that was what the rules required. The session continued. The proposal moved to the next stage of review. No one raised a voice. No one stood up. No one said the word that everyone was thinking. When the session ended, the delegations filed out in orderly silence. Sam and Megan walked together through the long corridor that led to the human delegation's quarters. Their footsteps echoed on the polished stone floor. "Something about this place is broken," Sam said quietly. Megan walked beside him, her tablet tucked under her arm. She was quiet for a moment, the way she always was when she was choosing her words with care. "It is not broken," she said. "It was built this way on purpose." Sam stopped walking. He looked at her. She looked back at him, unsteady and serious. "The silence is not a flaw in the system, Sam," she said. "The silence is the system, and it works exactly the way it was designed to work. It protects the powerful, and it keeps everyone else quiet." Sam stood there in the corridor for a long time after she walked away. He could still hear the echo of the Dravani delegate's voice in his head, smooth and approved and devastating. And beneath it, the silence of the Pelori, sitting with closed eyes, and unable to say the one word that mattered. He did not know it yet, but that was the moment everything began to change. 6 months before Sam Bennett stood in that corridor and felt something shift inside him, a young woman named Katie Brooks was sitting in a small communications room on a planet called Crescent Bay, watching the sky turn green. Katie was 29 years old. She had grown up in a quiet neighborhood in Denver, where her father ran a hardware store and her mother taught 2nd grade. She had joined Earth's Interstellar Logistics Corps because she wanted to see other worlds, and for the most part, the job had been exactly what she expected. Long shifts, paperwork, supply schedules, and the occasional beautiful sunset on a planet that was not her own. Crescent Bay was a shared colony world, and sitting on the border between Valori-administered space and the small patch of the galaxy that humans had been given when they joined the Union. The Valori were a tall, graceful species with pale blue skin and long, delicate fingers. They were known for their art, their music, and their extraordinarily complicated bureaucracy. Nearly 40,000 Valori civilians lived on Crescent Bay. The human settlement was much smaller, roughly 200 people, as mostly logistics workers and agricultural technicians who helped manage supply routes in the area. Katie liked the Valori. They were kind in their way. They smiled often, though their smiles looked different from human ones. more like a slow tilt of the head, with the eyes half closed. She had made friends among them, or something close to friends. They shared meals sometimes. They talked about their families. It was good. And then the sky turned green. As the atmospheric bloom came without warning. It was a chemical reaction in the upper atmosphere, triggered by a combination of volcanic gases and an unusual solar flare. Within hours, a thick green haze began to settle over the main Valori population center. The air became toxic. Breathing it for more than a few minutes caused burning in the lungs. Breathing it for more than an hour caused permanent damage. Breathing it for more than 6 hours could kill. That Katie learned all of this within the first 30 minutes because the Valori scientists at the colony's research station sent an emergency data packet to every terminal on the planet. The data was clear. The danger was real. Tens of thousands of people needed to be evacuated or supplied with filtered air within the next 12 hours, or they would begin to die. Katie immediately went to the Valori administrative building to coordinate a response. What she found there stopped her cold, and the Valori administrators were sitting in a circle around a long table, and they were writing, not acting, not calling for help, writing. They were drafting a formal emergency communication to be sent to the nearest Valori fleet command, and they were doing it according to proper protocol. The message had to pass through 4 levels of language review before it could be transmitted. The first draft had already been rejected because it used the phrase immediate danger, which was classified as emotionally provocative under Valori communication standards. They were working on a second draft. Katie stood in the doorway and felt her chest go tight. "How long will this take?" she asked. The senior administrator, a Valori named Tasana, looked up with calm, tired eyes. "If the second draft is approved, yes, the message could be transmitted within 8 hours." 8 hours, Katie repeated. "We must follow the process. If the message is sent without proper review, it could be classified as misinformation and ignored entirely. Or worse, it could trigger a diplomatic inquiry." Katie looked at Tasana. She liked Tasana. She respected her. But in that moment, she could not understand her. There were 40,000 people outside breathing poison. And the people in charge were arguing over word choices. She walked out of the building. She went back to the human communications room. She sat down at her terminal. And she did something that violated 6 separate interstellar communication statutes. She opened an unencrypted wideband broadcast channel. No security codes, no language review, no approval from anyone. She just opened the channel and started talking. "This is Katie Brooks, Earth Logistics Course, stationed on Crescent Bay. But we have a toxic atmospheric bloom covering the main population zone. Approximately 40,000 Valori civilians are at risk. The air is poisonous. People are already getting sick. We need emergency atmospheric filters, medical supplies, and transport ships for possible evacuation. I am broadcasting on an open channel because formal communication channels are delayed and people are dying. If anyone can hear this, please respond. I am sending coordinates now." She sent the message. Then she sent it again. And again. 3 independent cargo vessels picked up the broadcast within 2 hours. 2 were Korath freight ships carrying industrial supplies, and 1 was a small human merchant vessel that happened to be passing through the sector. They changed course immediately. The Korath ships carried atmospheric processing equipment that could be modified into emergency air filters. The human ship carried medical supplies. They arrived at Crescent Bay within 4 hours of Katie's broadcast. By the time the official Valori emergency request had finished its language review and been transmitted to Fleet Command, the cargo ships were already on the ground, unloading equipment, setting up filtration stations, and treating the sick. 31,000 Valori civilians survived because of those 4 hours. The aftermath was complicated. The Valori government filed a formal complaint about the protocol breach. Katie's open broadcast had bypassed every communication law on the books, and there were diplomats who argued that allowing it to go unpunished would set a dangerous example. If anyone could just broadcast anything without review, the entire structure of interstellar communication would collapse. That was the argument. Katie was reassigned back to Earth. She received an official reprimand on her service record, and she was told she had acted recklessly and that her broadcast could have caused panic, misinformation, or a diplomatic incident. She accepted the reprimand quietly. She packed her things and left Crescent Bay on a transport shuttle without making a fuss. But before she left, something happened that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A group of Valori civilians, survivors of the Bloom, found a way to send her a private message. It was short. It was not written in the approved formal style of Valori communication. It was written in plain, simple words, the kind that would never pass a language review. It said, "You are the one who spoke when no one else would. We will not forget." Katie read the message alone in her quarters. She sat on the edge of her bunk and held her tablet in both hands and cried, not because she was sad, but because she understood something that she had not fully understood before. The rules that were supposed to protect people were the same rules that almost killed them. And the only thing that had saved them was a woman in a small room choosing to open her mouth and say what was true. 6 months later, when Sam Bennett came to her door on a quiet street in Denver and asked her to tell her story, she did not hesitate. She sat him down at her kitchen table, poured 2 cups of coffee, and told him everything, every detail, every number, and every minute she had spent watching the clock while the administrators argued over the word danger. Sam listened without interrupting. When she was done, he asked her one question. "Would you do it again?" Katie looked at him with steady eyes. "I would do it faster," she said. Sam nodded. He thanked her, stood up, and walked out into the Denver afternoon with a feeling in his chest that was hard to name. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was something closer to certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you realize you already know what you have to do, and the only question left is when. Sam Bennett returned from Earth with a bag full of documents, a head full of Katie Brooks's story, and a plan that Megan Cole spent 3 full days trying to talk him out of. "You want to challenge the Codex," Megan said, sitting across from him in their small office at the human delegation quarters. The room was plain, a desk, 2 chairs. "I walk into a room with species that have walked into a room with species that have been governing the galaxy since before we discovered fire, and tell them their most fundamental rule is wrong." "I do not want to tell them it is wrong," Sam said. "I want to show them what it costs." Megan studied him for a long moment, and she had worked with Sam long enough to know the difference between one of his passing frustrations and the rare, quiet stubbornness that meant he had made up his mind. This was the second kind. She closed her tablet, leaned back in her chair, and said, "All right, then we do this properly." Their plan was not to abolish the Codex of Measured Discourse. That would have been impossible. The Codex was too old, too deeply woven into the structure of galactic governance. Asking the Council to throw it away would be like asking a city to tear down its own foundations. Instead, they would argue for something smaller but no less radical. An amendment. A single exception. They would request that humanity be granted the right to speak freely and without pre-approval during council sessions. The argument would not be based on human superiority. That was important. Megan understood the politics of the council well enough to know that any hint of arrogance would destroy their case before it began. The argument would be based on evidence. Cold, documented, undeniable evidence that the Codex itself was causing harm. Megan began her research. She pulled every record she could find from the Council's archives going back centuries. She was looking for a specific pattern, and she found it almost immediately. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight, so buried in the dry language of official reports. Every major delayed response to a crisis in Council history could be traced back to the speech protocols. Species that saw disasters coming could not say so in time because the process of getting the words approved took too long. Delegations that knew a proposal was predatory could not object because their language had been rejected by an auditor or their filing window had closed. The Codex did not just regulate speech, it regulated truth. It controlled when truth could be spoken, and by the time the truth was finally allowed into the room, it was often too late. She documented over 400 cases, 400 times when the rules of measured discourse had directly contributed to preventable suffering. She organized them, dated them, and cross-referenced them with the outcomes. The numbers were devastating, but numbers alone would not be enough. Sam knew that. He needed voices. He needed allies. And the first person he reached out to was Danny Price, a human attaché stationed on the Korath homeworld. Danny was 26, sharp and idealistic in the way that young people are before the galaxy has had time to wear them down. He had been living among the Korath for 2 years, learning their customs, studying their history, and he had stumbled onto something that he had been waiting for someone to care about. 70 standard cycles ago, a famine had struck a Korath agricultural world. The cause was a crop blight, easily treatable if caught early. The Korath delegation at the time had seen the early warning signs and attempted to raise the issue in council. Their statement was rejected 3 times by the linguistic auditor. The first draft was rejected for containing speculative language. The second was rejected for referencing unverified agricultural data. The third was rejected because the filing deadline had passed. So by the time the Korath were finally permitted to speak about the famine, 4 million people had died. Danny had found the records buried in a Korath historical archive. He sent them to Sam with a note that said, "They do not talk about this, but they have not forgotten." The second ally came from an unexpected place. Laura Fields was a human cultural attaché who had been living with the Tessic for 3 years. The Tessic were a quiet, thoughtful species, known for their philosophy and their deep respect for tradition. Laura had earned their trust slowly, carefully, by learning their language and participating in their rituals. And through that trust, she had learned something remarkable. The Tessic had once practiced free speech in their own governance. Centuries ago, before they joined the Galactic Union, their councils had been open forums where any citizen could stand and speak without restriction. It was considered a sacred right, and a part of their identity. But when they joined the Union and accepted the Codex, they were pressured to abandon the practice. The older Tessic still remembered. Some of them still mourned it. Laura shared this with Sam during a secure call. "They gave up something real when they joined," she said, "and I think some of them know it." Sam now had 3 pillars for his case: the Crescent Bay incident, showing the immediate cost of silence, the Korath famine, showing the historical cost, and the Tessic tradition, showing that free speech was not just a human idea, but something that other species had once valued and lost. He was feeling something close to hope when the message came from Seveth Ron. Seveth Ron was a senior Dravani diplomat, tall and smooth-skinned, with the kind of calm, measured voice that the Codex was designed to produce. He requested a private meeting with Sam at a neutral location, and a small chamber in the lower levels of the council building that was used for informal conversations. Sam went alone. Megan told him not to. He went anyway. Seveth Ran was already there when Sam arrived, standing beside a window that looked out into the dark of space. He did not turn around when Sam entered. "I know what you are building," Seveth Ran said. His voice was soft, almost friendly. "I have watched your advisor gathering records. I have noted your communications with attachés on other worlds. You intend to challenge the Codex." Sam said nothing. He waited. Seveth Ran turned to face him. His metallic eyes caught the light and reflected it back like mirrors. "I want you to understand something, Ambassador. The Codex is not simply a set of rules. It is the foundation of order. Without it, this council would dissolve into chaos. Every species would say whatever it wished, whenever it wished. And the result would not be freedom. It would be noise. It would be conflict. It would be war. With respect, Sam said, the Codex did not prevent the Korath famine. Sevoth Rand's expression did not change. There are always costs to order. The question is whether those costs are acceptable. 4 million dead, Sam said. Is that acceptable? The silence that followed lasted a long time. When Sevoth Rand spoke again, his voice was no longer friendly. If you bring this proposal before the council, he said, the Dravani hegemony will move to revoke humanity's provisional seat. We have the votes. You have been here 6 years, Ambassador. We have been here for 6,000. Consider very carefully whether the words you wish to speak are worth the price you will pay for speaking them. Sam looked at the Dravani diplomat, standing in the cold light of distant stars, and he felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet, a steady clarity, like a river finding its course. Thank you for the warning, he said, and he left. When he returned to the delegation quarters, Megan was waiting. She took one look at his face and knew. They threatened us, she said. It was not a question. They threatened to revoke our seat. Megan set her tablet down on the desk. She folded her hands. So what do you want to do? Sam looked out the window at the vast, silent plaza below. Oh, want to speak anyway? He said. The session want to speak anyway, he said. The session began like every other session had begun for the last 900 years. The speaker of the council, an elderly Korath named Idris Then, stood at the center of the great circular chamber and opened the proceedings with the traditional words of measured greeting. His voice was deep and formal, and his posture was straight despite his age. He had served as speaker for over 40 cycles, and he had never once seen anyone break the rules of the Codex in his chamber. He did not expect today to be any different. 214 delegations sat in their assigned seats, arranged in rising tiers that curved around the room like the inside of a bowl. The Dravani sat near the front, as they always did. The smaller delegations sat in the back, as they always did. The human delegation sat somewhere in the middle, in the modest seats that had been assigned to them when they joined 6 years ago. Sam Bennett sat in his chair and looked out across the chamber. Beside him, Megan Cole held her tablet in her lap, her face calm but her fingers tight around the edges. She had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this moment, organizing evidence, drafting arguments, running simulations of how the council might react. See, she had prepared Sam as well as anyone could be prepared for what he was about to do. But there was a limit to preparation. At some point, a person simply had to stand up and speak. The agenda moved through its scheduled items. A trade update from the Korath sector, a resource allocation report from the outer colonies, a minor border adjustment between 2 species that no one in the room seemed particularly interested in. For scheduled remarks. This was the window for scheduled remarks. This was the window in which delegations could make formal statements on any topic as long as those statements had been submitted, reviewed, and approved in advance. Idris then called for remarks. A brief pause followed, as it always did, while delegations prepared to read their approved texts. And Sam Bennett stood up. He did not have an approved text. He had not submitted anything to the linguistic auditor. He had not filed a notice of intent to speak. He simply stood, and the motion alone was enough to pull every eye in the chamber toward him. Idris then looked at Sam with a puzzled expression. He checked his records. There was no scheduled statement from the human delegation. He raised one long-fingered hand. See, to talk. A ripple went through the to talk. A ripple went through the chamber. It was not a sound exactly. It was more like a shift in the air, a collective intake of breath from 213 species who had never, in their lives, heard someone speak in this chamber without permission. The translation systems stuttered. They were designed to process preloaded. They approved texts, not live, unscripted language. For a few seconds, half the chamber heard nothing but static. Then the systems adapted, the way they were built to do in emergency situations, and Sam's words began to flow through every earpiece and neural translator in the room. He did not raise his voice. That was the first thing that surprised them. They expected shouting. They expected chaos. They expected exactly what the Codex had always warned about. On the uncontrolled emotional outburst of a species too primitive to understand the value of measured speech. Instead, they got a man from Ohio talking in a calm, steady voice, the same voice he had used for 15 years to help people find common ground. 6 months ago, Sam said, a toxic atmospheric bloom struck a shared colony world called Crescent Bay. 40,000 Valori civilians were at risk. The Valori administration on the ground attempted to send a distress call through proper channels. Their first draft was rejected because it contained language deemed emotionally provocative. Their second draft was still under review when people began to die. He paused. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the translation systems was the loudest sound in the room. A human logistics officer named Katie Brooks broke protocol. She opened an unencrypted broadcast channel and described exactly what was happening, in plain language, to anyone who could hear. 3 ships responded. They arrived in 4 hours. 31,000 people survived because one woman decided that saving lives mattered more than following the rules of approved speech. He looked across the chamber. The Valori delegation sat very still. Their lead diplomat's eyes were fixed on Sam, and there was something in them that was impossible to read. 70 cycles ago, Sam continued, a famine struck a Korath agricultural world. The Korath delegation attempted to raise the alarm in this very chamber. Their statement was rejected 3 times by the linguistic auditor. By the time they were allowed to speak, 4 million of their people had starved. He turned toward the Korath section. Idris Then, the speaker, stood at his podium with his hand still raised in the signal to stop. But he had not repeated the signal, and he had not called security. He stood there, perfectly still, and listened. I am not here to insult this council, Sam said. I am not here to say that the Codex is without value, but I am here to say something that I believe every delegation in this room already knows, and that the rules of this chamber have prevented anyone from saying out loud. He turned toward the Dravani delegation. Sevath Ron sat in his seat with his smooth gray face perfectly composed, his metallic eyes unblinking. The trade proposal currently before this council, submitted by the Dravani hegemony, will reroute 3 major fuel supply lines through Dravani-controlled space. The transit fees attached to this rerouting will triple fuel costs for the Pelori, the Yanesh, and the Saka. These 3 species depend on those supply lines for nearly all of their energy needs. He let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. If this proposal passes, their power grids will begin to fail within 2 cycles. Hospitals will lose power, heating systems will shut down, ships that carry food and medicine will be grounded. The proposal does not use the word starvation. It does not use the word suffering. It is written in language that has been carefully approved to avoid those words. But the outcome will be the same, regardless of what words we use to describe it. The Pelori delegate, the small creature with brown fur and wide eyes, was looking at Sam with an expression that needed no translation. And Sam spoke for 11 minutes. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He laid out facts in plain language. The kind of language that a person might use when sitting across a kitchen table from someone who needed to understand something important. He talked about the gap between what the rules allowed people to say and what the truth actually was. He talked about the cost of that gap, measured in lives. When he finished, he sat down. And the silence that followed was unlike anything the chamber had ever held. It was not the silence of protocol. It was the silence of recognition. The silence that comes when someone has said the thing that everyone already knew, but no one had been allowed to speak. Sevoth Ran moved quickly. Within minutes, the Dravani delegation filed a formal motion to censure the human delegation and revoke their provisional seat on the council. And the charge was a direct violation of the Codex of Measured Discourse. The evidence was undeniable. Sam had spoken without approval. The rules were clear. The motion required a simple majority to pass. The vote was called. Delegations entered their decisions through their private terminals. The results appeared on the central display for all to see. 62 delegations voted in favor of censure. 47 voted against, and 91 delegations, nearly half the council, abstained. So the motion failed. Megan stared at the numbers on the display. 91 abstentions. In the entire history of the council, an abstention count that high had never been recorded. The smaller delegations had not dared to vote against the Dravani openly, but they had refused to vote with them. In a chamber where silence was the only weapon most species had, 91 of them had chosen to use it. The Dravani trade proposal was quietly withdrawn the following day. No formal announcement was made. It simply disappeared from the agenda, as if it had never existed. That evening, Sam sat alone in his office. The lights were low. The plaza outside his window was dark and empty. Megan came in and set a cup of coffee on his desk. She had somehow found real coffee in a station that served 200 alien species, and Sam never thought to ask how. 11 minutes, she said, sitting down across from him. Why, that is all it took. Sam wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the warmth against his palms. It is not over, he said. No, Megan agreed. It is not. But it has started. They sat together in the quiet, and for the first time since Sam had arrived at the council, the silence in the room did not feel heavy. It felt like the pause between one sentence and the next, and the kind of pause that means someone is about to say something that matters. 3 cycles after Sam Bennett's unscheduled speech shook the council chamber, the formal deliberation period began. It was the most contentious procedural debate in living memory, and everyone knew it. The corridors that were usually quiet buzzed with low, careful conversations. Delegations that had not spoken to each other in decades were meeting in private rooms. Something had shifted, and even the oldest species in the Union could feel it. The question before the council was narrow but powerful. Should humanity be granted an amendment to the Codex of Measured Discourse, a permanent exception allowing human delegates to speak freely during official sessions without submitting their remarks for prior approval? It was not a question about abolishing the Codex. It was not a question about changing the rules for everyone. And it was a question about one species and whether that species should be allowed to do what it had already done, say what needed to be said, when it needed to be said. Megan Cole presented the formal case. She stood at the center of the chamber where the speaker usually stood, and she spoke with the kind of precision that the council respected. Her voice was calm. Her words were measured, not because the Codex required it, but because she understood that the best way to argue for the right to speak freely was to demonstrate that humans could use that right with care. She presented her evidence. Over 400 documented instances, stretching back centuries, where the Codex of Measured Discourse had directly contributed to delayed responses, preventable deaths, or exploitation through procedural manipulation. She organized them by category: famines, plagues, ecological disasters, predatory trade agreements. And in every case, the pattern was the same. Someone had seen the danger, someone had known the truth, and the rules had prevented them from saying it in time. She did not dramatize, she did not plead. She laid the numbers out like stones on a table and let the weight of them speak for itself. When she finished her presentation, the chamber was quiet in the particular way that it became quiet when something important had been said and everyone needed a moment to absorb it. Then the debate began. Several species rose to speak in support. Most of them were small delegations from the back rows, species that had spent centuries sitting in silence while larger powers shaped the galaxy around them. Their statements were short and careful, filed properly through the codex, but the content was clear. They had watched Sam Bennett speak without permission, and they had recognized something in it, something they had been missing. But the moment that shifted the room came from the Tessic delegation. Quorath Vess was old. Even by Tessic standards, he was very old. He moved slowly to the speaking position, his long robes trailing behind him, his pale eyes blinking in the chamber's blue light. He had been a member of the Tessic delegation for over 50 cycles, and in all that time he had never once spoken beyond the minimum required by his duties. He was known as a quiet presence, a figure of tradition and reserve. When he spoke, his voice was thin but steady, and the chamber fell silent in a way that even Sam's speech had not achieved. He said that the Tessic had once known what it meant to speak freely. Long ago, before they joined the Union, their councils had been places where any citizen could stand and say what was in their heart. It was considered sacred. It was part of who they were. When they joined the Union and accepted the Codex, they were told that free speech was primitive. That measured discourse was the mark of a civilized species and that they would need to leave their old ways behind. They did, and something in them broke. Quorath Vess said that watching a human stand in this chamber and speak without permission had reminded him of something his grandmother once told him. She told him that the first duty of any leader is not to speak wisely, it is to speak truthfully, because wisdom can wait, but truth cannot. He paused for a moment, and in that pause, Quorath Vess said that the Tessic was a very old man, and that he had been carrying a heavy thing for a very long time, and had finally decided to set it down. Quorath Vess said that the Tessic delegation supported the amendment. The Dravani response was fierce. Sevethran took the speaking position with the smooth, practiced grace that the Codex had been designed to cultivate. He argued that unregulated speech was not freedom, but chaos. And he said that the Codex existed because the galaxy had learned, through bitter experience, that words could be weapons, and that weapons needed to be controlled. He pointed to human history, their wars, their propaganda, their centuries of using language to manipulate and deceive. He said that giving humans the right to speak freely in the council was not an act of progress. It was an invitation to disaster. He warned that if this amendment passed, and it would be the beginning of the end of the order that had held the galaxy together for 12,000 years. His speech was polished. It was perfectly structured. Every word had been chosen with care. And when he finished, the chamber responded with the same respectful silence it always gave to a well-constructed argument. Then Sam Bennett was given the opportunity to deliver closing remarks. He stood slowly. He looked around the chamber, at the hundreds of faces watching him, and faces of species he had spent 6 years learning to understand. He had prepared remarks. Megan had helped him write them. They were good remarks, thorough and persuasive. He set them aside. "I am not going to stand here and tell you that humans are smarter than anyone in this room," he said. "We are not. We are not stronger. We are not older. We are not wiser. We are one of the youngest species in this union, and we know it." He took a breath. "But where we come from, we learned something a long time ago. We learned it the hard way, through wars and revolutions and all the mistakes that Delegate Sevethran has just described. He is right that we have used words to harm. He is right that our history is full of moments when speech was used as a weapon. But what we learned from all of that was not that speech should be controlled. What we learned is that the answer to harmful speech is more speech. The answer to a lie is the truth, spoken out loud. mic where everyone can hear it. He paused and looked toward the Pelori delegation. The small delegate with the brown fur was watching him with those wide, steady eyes. I am not asking this council to adopt human values. I am not asking anyone to change who they are. I am asking you to consider one thing. The most dangerous thing in a room full of intelligent beings is not the person who speaks out of turn. It is the silence that lets a preventable tragedy unfold because nobody was allowed to say stop. He sat down. The chamber held its silence for a long moment. The vote was called. It was not a landslide. It was not a sweeping, triumphant victory. The vote passed by a narrow margin, close enough that Sam could feel his heartbeat in his throat as the numbers appeared on the central display. But it passed. Humanity was granted a unique amendment to the Codex of Measured Discourse, and the right of unrestricted speech during council sessions. They were the only species with that right. At first, in the cycles that followed, 9 more species quietly filed their own amendment requests. The Tessic were the first, then the Pelori, then a handful of others, small delegations from the back rows, who had spent centuries in obedient silence and who had finally decided that they had something to say. The Dravani opposed every single one, and they fought each amendment with the full weight of their procedural expertise. They won some, they lost some, but the direction was clear. Something had changed in the council, something that could not be changed back. Megan Cole published a paper on the amendment that was read by every diplomatic corps in the Union. Danny Price was promoted to a senior advisory position on the Korath homeworld, where he worked alongside Korath historians to build a public archive of the famine that had been buried for 70 cycles. Laura Fields remained with the Tessic and helped them begin the long process of recovering their lost tradition of open council. And Katie Brooks, the woman who had started it all by opening a broadcast channel and saying what was true, watched the news of the amendment from her small house in Colorado. She was 40 now. She had left the logistics corps years ago. Oh, she lived quietly. She gardened. She read. She had a dog named Pete, who liked to sleep on her feet. She was sitting on her porch when the news came through on her tablet. She read the headline. She read the summary. She read Sam Bennett's closing remarks, quoted in a dozen different publications across the galaxy. She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes when something you always believed turns out to be true. She set the tablet down, walked inside, and then poured herself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in warm, golden strips. "About time," she said to no one in particular. Pete wagged his tail. Outside, the sky was blue and clear and wide open, the way it always is in Colorado, and somewhere far above it, in a chamber that had been silent for 12,000 years, the galaxy was slowly, carefully, one voice at a time, learning how to speak.